Good afternoon and welcome to our special webinar, The Past, Present, and Uncertain Future of LGBTQ+ Rights. For those who don't know me, my name is Brian Murphy, and I'm a shareholder at Klinedinst San Diego office. I am very proud to serve on the firm's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, and we are very excited to be hosting this program today, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. In 2014, I started volunteering for Lambda Legal, co-chairing its annual fundraiser here in San Diego. Now, if you're not familiar with Lambda, really great organization. It's the nation's oldest legal advocacy group, fighting for full legal equality of LGBT people and of everyone living with HIV. Since 1973, Lambda has pursued court cases that protect and advance the rights of LGBT people. And the list of historic cases that Lambda attorneys have argued and won is way, way too long to review right now. But some notable victories that you've probably heard of are Obergefell versus Hodges, and that's the case that secured marriage equality. And more recently, Bostock versus Clayton County. That was the case that held that employment discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation is barred by Title VII. And I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, who is Kevin Jennings, the CEO of Lambda Legal. And I could spend this whole webinar just describing Kevin's qualifications and accomplishments, but we don't have that much time, so I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights. Kevin first made his mark on the gay rights movement while teaching high school history. He founded the nation's first Gay-Straight Alliance Club in 1988 and started what would become the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, or GLSEN, in 1990, with the mission of making our schools safer for all children, regardless of orientation or gender expression. In 1992, the governor of Massachusetts appointed Kevin to co-chair the Education Committee of the Governor's Commission on Gay and Lesbian Youth. And Kevin was the principal author of the commission's report, which was adopted as state policy in 1993, making Massachusetts the very first state to ban discrimination against students on the basis of sexual orientation. In 1996, Kevin helped write and produce a film called Out of the Past, the first documentary on LGBTQ history for young people, which won the Sundance Film Festival Audience Award for Best Documentary. By 2008, when Kevin stepped down as the head of GLSEN, he had grown that organization nationwide with over 3,700 Gay-Straight Alliance clubs registered. In 2009, Kevin was appointed by the Obama administration to serve as an Assistant Deputy Secretary for the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools, where he focused on student safety, classroom discipline, and bullying. And while at the Department of Education, Kevin led the administration's nationwide anti-bullying campaign. After leaving the administration, Kevin ran the Arcus Foundation, which is the world's largest private funder of LGBTQ rights, and the Tenement Museum, which is dedicated to the immigrant experience in the United States. And most recently, he served as an executive producer of the 2019 PBS documentary, The Lavender Scare, which details the McCarthy-era witch hunts for LGBTQ people, and the 2020 HBO documentary, Welcome to Chechnya, which documents the ongoing horrific extermination of LGBTQ people in the Russian Republic of Chechnya, and was shortlisted for the 2021 Academy Award for Best Documentary. Kevin came to Lambda Legal as its CEO in 2019, and he did all the things I just described while writing and publishing 7 award-winning books. So today, Kevin is taking a break from that very busy schedule to talk to us about the history of the gay rights movement in the United States, the pioneers that made it happen, the legal progress that we've made, and where we are headed in the future. So without further delay, please welcome the CEO of Lambda Legal, Mr. Kevin Jennings.
Brian, thank you for that overly glowing introduction. I very much appreciate it. And very grateful to Klinedinst for having me here today to speak with you all. As Brian mentioned, I started my career actually as a high school history teacher. And you can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the teacher. So we're going to have a little history lesson today. And we'll close by talking about current events, important part of every history class. And I call this talk Queeros because it really looks at the people who made LGBTQ history. And I'd be curious, I'll look in the chat box afterwards. I'd love at the end of the lecture if you would just say to me, I knew 10% of this, I knew 90% of this. I'm just curious to know how much of it you might have known before I share this content today. I think if there's one thing I want you to remember that you may not be aware of is this. LGBTQ people are not the newcomers to the North American continent. Prejudice against us is the newcomer. And we know this because of the documented history of what are called two-spirit people in Native American communities. Two-spirit people were people who felt their body was inhabited by both male and female spirits. They would play the role of a third, or in the case of the Navajo, even a fourth gender within their tribal communities. And they were highly esteemed because the belief was that since they had been given extra spiritual blessings, that they must be people who could be looked up to and revered and respected. If we were to use modern terminology to describe these folks, we would probably say they were transgender. Now, this is very, very interesting because two-spirit people were so well respected among the Zuni people. This person, Wewa, was a two-spirit person in the Zuni tribe in the late 1800s, that when they had to negotiate a new treaty with the Washington government, they sent Wewa as part of the delegation of their most esteemed citizens to do the negotiations in Washington. And this picture of Wewa was taken in Washington in the 1880s. That's such a fascinating contrast with where we are today, where there is so much transphobia in our society and so much violence towards trans people that the American Medical Association has deemed it a public health emergency. Among the Native people of North America, though, people who we would today consider transgender were seen as leaders and to be esteemed. Now, why did that change? It changed because of the coming of European settlers in the 15 and 1600s who brought very different attitudes around gender and sexuality. This is the first capital laws code of British North America. It was passed in Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1642. I know it's hard to read, so I'll just cut right to the chase and go right to, by the way, of these 15 capital crimes, 9 of them dealt with sex. So the Puritans were a little obsessed with that. And the one that's relevant to us is number 8. If a man lieth with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed abomination, they both shall surely be put to death. This is the forerunner of what would become called in modern times sodomy laws, which criminalize same-sex relationships and were on the books in some American states until the 21st century. We'll come back to that later in the talk. But despite the persecution, the criminalization, the demonization of LGBTQ people found a way to survive and form community. This is a map of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City in the 1930s and 40s, and all of the orange squares were bars or clubs or restaurants that catered to Black lesbians. And you can see how many orange squares there are on the map, and this is just one subset of the larger LGBTQ community. LGBTQ people found a way to survive. In fact, in England, LGBTQ people learned to speak their own language, which was called Polari. And it was a language that was developed so that they could talk about things that were happening in front of straight people, and straight people wouldn't know what they were saying. So I'm going to play like a 1-minute film clip for you in Polari. See if you can figure out what they're talking about.
Nearly got nabbed myself the other week. I just finished plating this chicken in the Cottage Ajax Clackett Lane, you know the one. Anyway, I'm mincing outside, wiping my screech. And who should I bump into? But one of your ugly daughters. There's a poof in there, I said. Nabbed him with his caffees down, I suppose. She didn't have a varded it coming. Must have been a right Ferricadooza. Sharda.
You're disgusting.
What? Oh, go on. Put your fakements in your little shush bag off your scarper. You forgot your glossy.
What is actually being described in that scene was a pretty common experience that gay men in particular had in Western societies, where the police would entrap them and accuse them of solicitation. They tried to entrap the man telling the story, and when he said, no, 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 there's a poof in there, there's a gay guy in the washroom, and he sent the police after them, and that's why the other man says he's disgusting, because he basically threw another gay man under the bus to save himself. But it's really fascinating to me. It speaks to the resilience and creativity of the LGBTQ community, that people literally developed their own language so they could communicate. In the late 1800s, people began political organizing. This man, Magnus Hirschfeld, created what we believe is the first LGBTQ rights organization in Berlin in the late 1890s, called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was lobbying for the repeal of German sodomy laws. He got 120,000 prominent Germans, including people like Albert Einstein, to sign his petition. This man, Henry Gerber, was a German immigrant, and we believe he must have learned about what Hirschfeld was doing, because when he came to America and returned after serving World War I, actually, he created America's first LGBTQ rights organization, the Society for Human Rights, which was incorporated in the state of Illinois on December 10th, 1924. Now, a lot of people think that the LGBTQ rights movement is of recent vintage. It's important to realize that the first group was actually created almost a century ago. Tragically, the robust early LGBTQ rights movement in Germany was literally snuffed out by the Nazis. The Nazis required that gay men be put in concentration camps. You'll see in this black and white picture, you'll see a fabric triangle. If this was in color, those triangles would be pink, just as Jews were required to wear yellow stars in the concentration camps. Gay men were required to wear pink triangles. We don't know the exact number of gay men who died. We do know it's in the tens of thousands. And the reason we don't is because after the war, it literally remained a crime in Germany to be gay. So the survivors did not want people to know why they'd been put in the concentration camps in the first place. Obviously, World War II was a momentous event worldwide and a momentous event for America, but it was especially important for LGBTQ plus people in America. In 1940, 60% of Americans lived in towns of 10,000 or fewer people. So if you were an LGBTQ plus person, you probably felt pretty isolated. You then joined the military, which was sex segregated at the time, also racially segregated. And you found out that you were not the only one, that there were a lot of people like you. The blog Humans of New York goes around and interviews people in New York and simply asks them questions. I think they probably didn't expect the answer they got from this elderly man in Union Square Park. I had a ton of fun during the Korean War. There were 10 to 15 gay soldiers on the base. As long as we weren't seen doing anything, they couldn't discharge us. So we all rented a hotel room once a month, plastered the wall with street playbills from A Streetcar Named Desire, and had lots of sex. So this was a common experience for LGBTQ people in the military in the 1940s and 50s. And when they came back to cities like San Diego and San Francisco and Seattle and Boston and New York and Washington, and they got off the boat when they were discharged and thought about returning to that small town where they were going to be the only one, or staying in cities like San Diego, they stayed in cities like San Diego. And the size of the post-war LGBTQ plus communities in cities exploded. Now, this leads us to what I call Law 1 of LGBTQ plus history. The more visible we are, the more we are attacked. And those attacks began in the late 1940s, early 1950s. You probably studied in school the Red Scare, which was the witch hunts for supposed communists who were a security threat to America, according to Senator McCarthy. Well, Senator McCarthy felt the same way about homosexuals, or what he would have called perverts. And in 1950, the Senate actually launched an investigation into the employment of known perverts by the federal government. This was such a hysteria that in 1953, when he became president, one of the first things President Eisenhower did was sign an executive order which banned the employment of known perverts by the federal government or by federal government contractors. Elements of this executive order would remain on the books until President Clinton finally revoked it in the 1990s. This period, called the Lavender Scare, was a very dark time for LGBTQ plus people. Remember, it's still a crime to be in an LGBTQ plus relationship. It is still considered a mental illness. You could be put in a mental institution against your will, and now you can't even legally hold a job. Yet in 1955, these two women, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, created America's first lesbian rights organization in San Francisco. I want you to think about the courage it took to create an organization like that in 1955, 2 years after President Eisenhower's executive order. Phyllis and Del will come back later in the talk. This is a drag performer whose name was Jose Sadia, who performed in the bars in San Francisco. In the 50s and 60s, it was pretty standard practice for the police to come into the bars where LGBTQ people congregated, to threaten to extort them for money, to rough them up, and there was very little people could do about it because, remember, being LGBTQ was still a crime. So in 1961, Jose Sadia did something that no out person had ever done before in American history. Jose ran for public office to be a supervisor for the city and county of San Francisco. Now, you maybe have heard of someone named Harvey Milk who would run for and win the same office in 1978. Jose, unfortunately, did not win, but they made history by being the first out LGBTQ plus person in American history to run for public office 17 years before Harvey Milk. You probably recognize the man on the left in this photo, Martin Luther King Jr. You may not recognize the man on the right, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was a nonviolent civil disobedience advocate. He was raised a Quaker, which is where he learned about the philosophy. And he was an important mentor to Martin Luther King in terms of how to use nonviolent civil disobedience to achieve your goals. King respected Rustin very deeply, but the fact that he was openly gay led to him repeatedly being fired from jobs in the civil rights movement because he was considered an embarrassment. In 1963, King announced he was going to do a march on Washington, and with only 6 weeks' notice before the march. And he approached the rest of the civil rights leadership and he said, "You know who the best person is to organize this march. It's Bayard Rustin." And Rustin was put in charge of the march, where Martin Luther King gave the final speech of the day, the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which all of us have seen so many times. What has been forgotten by history is that the first speaker of the day was an openly gay Black man named Bayard Rustin, who you see here on the steps of Lincoln Memorial delivering his remarks. Now, LGBTQ rights activists watched what the civil rights movement for Black people was doing, and they learned. Among them was the second man in this picket line, a man named Frank Kameny. Frank Kameny was a Harvard PhD who was fired from his job in the government due to the Lavender Scare. He sued. His suit went all the way to the Supreme Court, which refused to hear it. So in 1965, having exhausted all legal avenues available to him, on April 17th, he organized the first picket of the White House for LGBTQ equality. And this is some of the participants in that picket on April 17th, 1965. Keep in mind the courage that took. In 1965, it was still illegal in 49 states. If anybody can guess what was the first state to decriminalize same-sex relationships and put it in the chat box, I'll give you a free copy of one of my books. It was still a crime in 49 states to even be known to be LGBTQ. Yet here these people were picketing the White House. One of his closest friends was a woman named Barbara Giddings, who was a lesbian in Philadelphia. She decided she could do the same thing, and beginning in 1967, she organized something called the Annual Reminder, which was a picket of Independence Hall on July 4th, the busiest day of the year, to remind America that not all people yet have their civil rights. Then in June of 1969, the police came into a bar in New York called the Stonewall, and they started roughing the patrons up. This, as I mentioned before, was standard operating procedure in the 50s and 60s. But something different happened that night. The denizens of the bar fought back, and they drove the police out of the bar. And that event, the so-called Stonewall Riot, was a turning point in the LGBTQ rights movement. The New York Times didn't think so at the time. This is all the coverage they gave it, deep in the metro section. But here are the folks who've liberated the Stonewall Bar outside of it right after having done so. And among leaders in that rebellion were two trans women of color, the woman on the left, Sylvia Rivera, the woman on the right, Marsha P. Johnson, who would create the first trans rights organization in America in 1969. So what happened after Stonewall was an explosion of organizing for LGBTQ rights began. And there was rapid progress in the 70s and early 80s until in 1982, the first state to pass a comprehensive civil rights law protecting the rights of people based on sexual orientation enacted it. Once again, go to the chat box. If you can guess what state enacted the first gay rights law, I'll also send you a free book. But also in 1981, this small article appeared in the New York Times, July 3rd, 1981. A rare cancer was starting to kill young gay men. Doctors didn't understand why this was happening because it was a cancer that was usually not fatal and usually did not strike young people. So they nicknamed it gay cancer. Then they began to realize that these young men were dying of multiple diseases you shouldn't die of in your 20s and 30s. And they realized their immune systems were collapsing. So they changed the name to GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Then they began to realize other people were dying in the same manner and that it had nothing to do with being gay. And they changed the name to the disease we know today as AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. AIDS would wipe out my generation of gay men. My first boyfriend died, my college roommate died, my best friend from college died. In fact, almost 800,000 Americans have died of AIDS since this article was printed in 1981. So many gay men in New York City alone died of AIDS between 1981 and 1995 that total is higher than the total number of Americans who were killed in the Vietnam War in one city. But this leads to what I call Law 2 of LGBTQ plus history. The more we are attacked, the more people organize and fight back. And an example of that is this gentleman, Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer knew his history, and he founded a group called the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, to use nonviolent civil disobedience techniques that he had seen the civil rights movement use so effectively to force the government to pay attention to AIDS. He took the pink triangle that gay men had been forced to wear in the concentration camps in the Nazi era, and he turned it upside down and coined the slogan, "Silence equals death," that this time gay people would not go silently to their deaths. ACT UP took to the streets of the country, doing things like seizing the New York Stock Exchange at the ringing of the opening bell and seizing the Food and Drug Administration headquarters in Washington to force the government to accelerate research into treatments for AIDS. And finally, by the mid to late 90s, treatments became available and AIDS went from being a sure death sentence to being a manageable chronic illness. Now, at that time, I was a high school teacher in first Rhode Island, where I was forced out of my first job because I was gay. And then I went to my second job in Concord, Massachusetts. I was very nervous about students finding out that I was gay because I'd already lost one job. You've probably figured out now that Massachusetts and Rhode Island were not one of the two states that passed the first civil rights law because I had no legal protections. But I always tell LGBTQ plus teachers that students always know who the gay teacher is. And sure enough, one of them figured it out and came to me one day and came out to me. And he said he was thinking of killing himself. I was 24, had no training, and said all I could think of to say, which was, let's go see the counselor. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "Why shouldn't I kill myself? My life isn't worth saving anyway." That took me back to how I felt growing up in North Carolina 10 years before, when I had tried to take my own life. And I made myself a promise that day that whatever I did with the rest of my life, I would work to make sure that the next generation of LGBTQ kids did not grow up feeling that their lives were not worth living anyway. So a few weeks later, November 10th, 1988, I got up at our school and I did an assembly talk where I came out to the entire school community. Now, November 10th, 1988 was a very different time, folks. There's only one state that's protecting you from legalized discrimination, and it's not Massachusetts. Gay men were dying by the tens of thousands, and Ronald Reagan was president. Yet, the next day, a young girl came in my office and said, "I want to start a club to fight homophobia." And I was kind of surprised because she was a ninth grader. She wasn't my student. I didn't know her really. And I said, well, okay, nice to meet you. Tell me why you care so passionately about this subject. And she said, oh, that's easy. My mother's a lesbian and I'm tired of hearing my family get put down around this school. Naive little me had never thought about the fact that I probably had students that had LGBTQ parents. So I said to her, what do you want to call this club then? And she said, I don't know, you're gay and I'm straight. Let's call it the Gay Straight Alliance. And that was the first GSA in America. I'm happy to tell you that now over half of all American high schools have GSAs. And the rights of students to do so was won by Lambda Legal in the Colleen versus Orange County Unified case in the year 2000. Remember I told you the sodomy laws would come back up in the talk? Well, they're here. Because in 2003, these two men took their case to the Supreme Court. The man on the right is Tyrone Garner. The man on the left is John Lawrence. They were arrested in where they lived in Houston, Texas, after being caught in the act of having sex as the police executed a no-knock warrant. And they decided that they wanted to fight back. So Lambda Legal represented them. And in 2003, in the Lawrence versus Texas decision, the Supreme Court ruled that sodomy laws were unconstitutional. And for the first time since 1642, it was legal to be LGBTQ in America. That same year, these two women sued the state of Massachusetts, Hillary and Julie Goodrich. They argued that they had been denied a marriage license only because they were both women, and this was discrimination based on gender. In November of 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court agreed with them, making Massachusetts the first state in the country to grant marriage equality to same-sex couples. Now, remember Phyllis Martin and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, the two women who started the Daughters of Bilitis back in 1955 in San Francisco? They were still alive 53 years later when Lambda Legal won the right of people here in the state of California to marry if they were of the same sex. Then Mayor of San Francisco, today Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, announced that he would personally officiate the first wedding and that it had to be Phyllis and Del. So here is then Mayor Newsom officiating Phyllis and Del's wedding in 2008, 53 years after they founded the Daughters of Bilitis. Del would die a few months later. Phyllis would live until 2020. In 2015, in one of the cases that was already mentioned by Brian, Obergefell versus Hodges, Lambda Legal would win the right of same-sex couples to marry nationwide at the Supreme Court. Remember Frank Kameny, the guy who picketed the White House in 1965? Well, here he is in the Oval Office 46 years later in 2011, shaking the hand of President Obama, who's just signed an executive order saying that same-sex couples should have the same rights and benefits if they work for the federal government as opposite-sex couples. Frank went from picketing a government that denied him the right to have a job to shaking the hand of the president who guaranteed the right of equal treatment for LGBTQ employees. Frank would die in October of 2011, about 6 months after this photo. He died on what's called National Coming Out Day, October 11th, which is kind of poetic. Now, I've been telling you all these hopeful stories of people resisting and fighting back and triumphing in the cases of Phyllis and Del and Frank. So you may be thinking, well, things are all better now, right? So let's not go that far. If you live in one of the countries that are shaded red on this map, you can still be put in jail for having a same-sex relationship. Almost 70 countries still criminalize same-sex relationships. If you live in one of the countries that was just shaded black, you can still be put to death. In 2022 alone, 286 anti-LGBTQ+ bills have been introduced into 37 different state legislatures across the country. Here's a map of where those states that have considered such bills, they're all shaded in red. So I think we'd like to imagine sometimes this is an isolated phenomenon, but in reality, most of the country is considering anti-LGBTQ legislation. And it falls into four major categories. First, what we call don't say gay bills, which were most notoriously passed in Florida, which censor the rights of students and teachers to say anything about sexual orientation or gender identity. The second category is bans on young people participating in their school sports teams if they're transgender. The third are bans on gender-affirming medical care for trans youth. And the fourth are restrictions on the ability of trans people to correct their identity documents like their driver's licenses. Lambda Legal is going to court in Florida around the Don't Say Gay bill. We are already in court in West Virginia, where we've won a preliminary injunction allowing 11-year-old Becky Pepper Jackson to participate on her middle school sports team. We are going to be going to court in Florida again around the exclusion of gender-affirming care for trans youth. And we're in court in Oklahoma, where they've tried to ban the right of trans people to correct their identity documents. So we are deeply engaged in all of these legal battles across the country, even as I speak. In fact, we were just in the Texas Supreme Court last Wednesday. Now, what can you do to help? Because I know at the end of talks like this, people are like, that's great, what do you want me to do? Well, first, you can volunteer your time. Lambda Legal operates a national legal help desk where we take over 5,000 calls a year from people who have been discriminated against because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status. Everyone gets an attorney. We can't represent but a small fraction of those people, but we have a thing called our Cooperating Attorneys Network, where individual attorneys agree to take cases that Lambda Legal can't. Secondly, volunteer your firm's time as a pro bono partner. There's no way we could argue this many cases in this many states without pro bono partnerships with firms like yours that enable us to extend our reach. Third, if you know people are being mistreated, send them to our help desk. You can either go to lambdalegal.org/helpdesk, or you can call 1-833-LGBTQ-LAW. And then finally, I'm not going to be shy. We rely on donations. Over 80% of our budget comes from individuals like you and me who write checks to support our work. If you have financial resources to spare, consider coming tonight to the fundraiser at Rich Siegel's, learning more about what we're doing and supporting our work. I want to close by telling you two last stories. The first is the story of the woman on the right in this photograph, Amy Stevens. The woman on the left is Lambda Legal's legal director, Sharon McGowan. Amy Stevens is a trans woman from Michigan who in 2014, when she came out at her workplace, was fired from her job. But remember, law too of LGBTQ plus history. The more we are attacked, the more we fight back. Amy went to court. In October of 2019, she had her day in court, specifically the Supreme Court, where they heard her case, the first case in American history on the rights of trans people ever heard in the highest court in our land. As Brian referenced earlier, in June of 2020, that case, which was a consolidated case, so it's known as Bostock, came down with a ruling, a 6-3 ruling by the court that it was illegal to fire people from their jobs because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. But it's not quite the happy ending you might hope. Amy Stevens died in May of 2020, a month before the Bostock ruling. She did not live to see justice done in her case. And as you know, justice deferred is often justice denied. Now, in the 1950s, there was the first LGBTQ plus rights magazine published in America. It's called One Magazine. It was published in Los Angeles. It was illegal at the time to mail anything about homosexuality through the mail. So their first issues were impounded by the Postal Service, and they sued. And in One versus Olson in 1956, the Supreme Court upheld their right to mail their magazine through the mail, which is the Supreme Court's first favorable ruling on LGBTQ plus rights in 1956. I'm fascinated by One. I own almost every copy. It published from 1952 to 1969. And in the letters to the editor in October 1954, I found this letter which really spoke to me. I will always remain willing to support, in my small way, any effort to reduce intolerance toward a minority group in the United States. Intolerance is basically as un-American as communism. Remember, this is the McCarthy era. This is the line that gets me. I realize the road ahead of us is long and difficult, but that part of the road already traveled has been pretty tough too. I realize the road ahead of us is long and difficult. Indeed it is. You saw in the Dobbs decision 2 weeks ago that in his concurring opinion, Justice Thomas called for the overturn of Obergefell versus Hodges and Lords versus Texas, two of Lambda Legal's landmark Supreme Court victories. You've seen that in almost 70 countries, it's still illegal to be LGBTQ+. That in America, 3/4 of states are considering anti-LGBTQ+ laws, even as we speak. The road ahead of us is going to be long and difficult. But that part of the road already traveled by people like Amy Stevens and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon and Bayard Rustin and Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Frank Kameny. It was pretty tough too. And if they had the courage to stand up and fight in what were far scarier and darker times than these, we need to do the same. There's a second reason why this letter speaks to me. It wasn't safe for people to sign their names to the letters because, as you know, it was still a criminal act to be LGBTQ and you could lose your job. So they simply put, when they published the letter, where the letter had come from. This letter came from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That's my hometown. That's the town where, when I was 16, I would try to take my own life because I felt so alone and afraid as a young gay person. Maybe if I had known that there was someone fighting for my rights in my town a decade before I was born, my own childhood might have been a little easier. So whoever you were who sent this letter in the 1950s, thank you. It was your courage that enabled the world to get better for me and for generations of LGBTQ people to come. There endeth the lesson, and we can go to questions and answers now.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Very powerful stuff. So a few minutes ago, you asked our viewers to put into the chat their guesses about what state, I believe it was what state had the first protections for LGBT.
Well, there were two questions. Which state was the first state to decriminalize homosexuality? And what state was the first state to actually enact protections for people based on sexual orientation? I don't know why I can't see the chat box. I'm dying to see what your answers are. I'll tell you the answers and we'll see if anybody got them. The first state to decriminalize was Illinois in 1962. The first state to enact statewide protections for LGBT people was Wisconsin in 1982. So go Midwest.
All right. Well, we actually have two Wisconsins, Doug Lytle and Najwa, both guessed, and Phil Steffen, both guessed Wisconsin. And then Najwa got Illinois, and so did Raina. So we have 4 people that guessed correctly. Well
Wonderful.
done.
So send your addresses to Brian. And when I get back to New York on Friday, I will send you a book.
All right, very good.
That by the way, is, first of all, usually nobody gets it. To have 4 people get it, that's very impressive. Y'all know your stuff.
Yes, absolutely. There were a lot of people guessed California, which honestly would have been my guess. I hate to admit that I didn't know the answer to those. So yes, it's a surprising result there.
Yeah, people usually think it's going to be California or Massachusetts or New York or something. I found the chat box. Have I not stopped sharing screen? I thought I had stopped sharing screen. I am very, very excited that you all got the questions right.
Well done. Well done. All right. So we do have a few questions, and I think we have about 10 minutes left, so we do have some time for them. So let's go to the first one here. Okay. So this is something you just talked about, Kevin, or touched on a little bit. In his concurring opinion in the Dobbs case, Justice Thomas called on the court to revisit Lawrence and Obergefell. And that really undercut the majority's assurances that its reasoning attacking privacy rights in the Dobbs case would go no further than the abortion issue. So that's made a lot of people nervous. And I think that's what this is getting at. And given the current makeup of the court, are you expecting the court to limit or reverse some of these landmark gay rights decisions?
I think it's a distinct possibility. And he didn't just mention Lawrence and Obergefell, he also mentioned Griswold, which you probably know was the birth control case in Connecticut in 1965. So we're talking about rolling things back to before I was born. So it's very disturbing. If you read the opinion, the majority opinion penned by Justice Alito, the logical next step is to go after Lawrence and Obergefell. In fact, the guy who wrote the Texas abortion ban has already announced that he's going to challenge Lawrence. So I think that we are in a very, very precarious situation right now, and we're going to need all of our creativity and all of our legal acumen to make sure that we don't actually go backwards in this country.
What, and this is my own question. I mean, what do you make of the court's assurances that, there were a couple of points in the Dobbs opinion where they really kind of tried to wall it off, right? And it was, this is only about abortion, and abortion is different, and so on. What do you make of that? Do you think that's disingenuous? Or do you think that's
well, I'll just say this. In the case of 4 of the people currently serving on the court, during their confirmation hearings, they said they would let stare decisis rule when it came to Roe versus Wade. And look what they just did. As my mama would say, Kevin, I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them.
Your mom sounds like a wise woman.
My mom was a very, very smart woman who only had a 6th grade education, but she had great sayings, having grown up in Appalachia without running water or electricity. And I'm planning to write an 8th book when I retire called Management Tips from the Trailer Park, which is where I'm going to use all of my mom's sayings, which I use all the time in my management myself.
I love it. I love it. My mom was from Kentucky, so I think I've heard some of those things. Okay, so next question. This is kind of along the same lines. It says, I don't want to see the Supreme Court roll back its decisions on LGBT rights. So what can I do? And I think the question is, what can the individuals listening today do to help? What are the most effective ways to make their voices heard?
Well, I think you have 4 assets, basically. You have your voice. Right now, Congress is considering a piece of legislation called the Equality Act, which would extend comprehensive civil rights protections to LGBTQ plus people. It has passed the House. President Biden has promised to sign it. It's held up in the Senate. And one senator I spoke to recently told me she was getting 10 times as many calls against the bill as for it. So use your voice, contact your senators and tell them you need to see these things written into law, because as we know, court decisions can be overturned. So we need to have this codified. Secondly, your vote. Let candidates know that you care about these issues and you'll be watching their stands before you vote. Third, your time. As I mentioned, you can volunteer with Lambda Legal. You can volunteer. There's a great community center here in San Diego. There's a great youth program. Mentor a young person. Give some of your time. And then finally, of course, as every nonprofit executive will tell you, you have your money. And if you have the ability to share some of your financial resources, that is greatly appreciated. So you've got your voice, your vote, your money, and your time.
Absolutely. All right, good stuff. So before we go to the next question, I now have 4 different requests for more quotes from Kevin's mom.
Okay, I'll give you the one I use all the time. When bad people would do predictably bad things, mom would say to me, Kevin, what do you expect from a pig but a grunt? So, not to be too disrespectful to Justice Thomas, but if my mother was still alive and she read his concurring opinion, I have a feeling I know what she would have said.
I love it. I love it. All right. Let's go to the final question here. Let's see. Oh, yeah. And this is something that you touched on a little bit earlier, too. So we're seeing waves of anti-trans legislation on a wide range of issues, everything from bathroom access to sports participation to access to gender-affirming medical care. Is there really an uptick in anti-trans legislation right now? And then there's a second question too, but let's talk about that one first.
Oh, absolutely. 5 years ago, there was approximately 10 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced in the state legislatures. As I mentioned now, and that number, by the way, I just pulled a couple of weeks ago, it's probably over 300 by now. So there has been a huge explosion of this kind of legislation, unlike anything we've ever seen before, frankly.
And are these laws, sometimes you'll see a state legislature pass a law that, you just cannot believe, and it's unconstitutional, and it's something that's sort of showboating, like playing to the base, even though they know it can't withstand constitutional scrutiny. I mean, is that what a lot of these laws are, or are they
this is all politics. This is all politics. It's all about riling people up. The easiest way to demonize a minority in Western history traditionally has been to say they're after your kids. Supposedly Jews drank the blood of Christian children and that justified pogroms and the Holocaust. Supposedly Black men were after little white girls, that justified lynching. Supposedly the Roma people in Europe stole children and that justified putting them in concentration camps. And supposedly LGBTQ plus people recruit. And that is really at the root of a lot of this stuff. It's trying to whip up hysteria around that old shibboleth that LGBTQ people are somehow a threat to your children. Well, the threat to your children is homophobia and transphobia. That's what's driving kids to kill themselves. It's not LGBTQ plus people. And you're absolutely right, Brian, that these people don't care about the unconstitutionality of what they're doing. I can give you a very specific example. In 2018, the state of Idaho legislature passed a law which prevented trans people from correcting their identity documents. Lambda Legal went to court. We got it struck down. 2 years later, in the middle of the pandemic, in late March 2020, the legislature passed the same law again. It had already been struck down in court 2 years before. So we went back to court, and ironically, we're in front of the exact same judge who was like, are you kidding me? I've ruled on this once. I can't believe this has come back to me. And it was struck down again. So this is not about what's constitutional or what's morally right. It's about winning political points by demonizing people. And they're able to get away with this around trans people because 2/3 of Americans still say they don't know a trans person. That means they just don't know the trans people in their life are trans, but they don't know an out trans person. So it's easy to spread lies and myths around people if they are not known to you.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why it's so important to be visible too, right?
Absolutely. The number one thing every study has shown that the most effective way of reducing prejudice towards LGBTQ people is if you actually know an LGBTQ plus person. It's not watching Will and Grace or the Ellen Show. It's actually knowing a real human being in your life who happens to be LGBTQ plus. So that's why, Harvey Milk was so insistent that people come out, because he knew that that was the key to demystifying our existence.
All right, I think we have enough time for one more question. What does Lambda Legal look like in 5 years? What accomplishments do you hope you're going to be looking back on 5 years from now?
Great question, and perfect timing because we just adopted a 5-year strategic plan. We actually took all of our practice areas, of which we discovered we had 27 different issues we were litigating on, and then we ranked them. We were forced to do what's called a forced choice ranking from 1 to 27 using 2 criteria. Number 1, could we win? And number 2, would people's lives really get better if we won? So how much would people's lives benefit if we won, and could we win? And then we ranked everything we did from 1 to 27. And I said, this is great. This is a lovely grid. We need to get this down to one sentence that a human being can understand, because nobody can follow a 27-piece grid. And we did. And that sentence is this: Lambda Legal will win new protections for the most vulnerable in our community while defending our community from attacks. And that's what we plan to do. You know, as proud as we are of our role in the fight for marriage equality, we're under no illusion that the main concern of homeless trans youth is whether or not they can get married. You know, that there are still lots of people in our community who are suffering, who still don't have their rights. And those are the populations we're going to prioritize. We have 7 practice areas. We have LGBTQ plus youth, LGBTQ plus seniors, LGBTQ plus immigrants, people with HIV, trans people, people facing systemic discrimination in the legal system, like LGBTQ people of color, and people facing systemic discrimination in areas like housing and employment. So those are the 7 vulnerable populations we're prioritizing. And of course, we're also having to spend an enormous amount of time and energy stopping things from going backwards. But where I hope we'll be in 5 years is that we will have turned back these attacks, and that we'll see some of the groups in our community who are most vulnerable have a new level of legal rights than they've ever had before.
Kevin, huge thanks to you for taking the time to come down and talk to us today. So on behalf of everybody here at Klinedinst, thank you again, Kevin, and thanks to each of you for watching us today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for joining us.